We also need to be ready to dig in for a long fight. We need to be ready to escalate using every tool in our toolkit. That includes surcharges or even outright restrictions on the critical minerals and electricity we supply to the United States. The critical minerals and electricity they depend on. Today, I'm writing to every senator, every congressman and woman, and the governors from New York State, Michigan, and Minnesota, telling them that these tariffs persist. If the Trump administration follows through on any more tariffs, we will immediately apply a 25% surcharge on the electricity we export. We will not hesitate to shut off their power as well. I'm encouraging my fellow premiers to follow suit.
Canada may have found a way to hit America where it hurts most. Ontario is threatening resources the U.S. relies on, turning electricity and minerals into powerful bargaining tools. Washington may have started the trade fight, but Canada could have a surprise waiting. Ontario just put American power on the table. As the trade war explodes, Premier Doug Ford is threatening to cut off electricity and critical minerals to the United States power that keeps roughly 1.5 million American homes and businesses running. Everything's on the table, Ford declared. I'll cut them off. Days after Canada walked away from trade talks and 50% tariffs went live, the lights across the American border have become a weapon. The threat came August 2026 in an interview with the Associated Press, and Ford did not soften it. He warned that Ontario could use electricity exports as leverage if President Trump keeps escalating tariffs against Canadian goods. Everything is on the table, Ford said, meaning electricity, critical minerals, and more could all become part of Canada's response. This is what makes the moment so explosive. Electricity is normally treated as a routine cross-border trade relationship, reliable power flowing quietly between neighbors. Ford is now openly discussing it as an economic weapon, something Canada could switch off to inflict pain on the United States. The 1.5 million figure needs careful explanation because it is a measure of scale, not an imminent blackout. Ontario has historically supplied electricity to parts of the United States, particularly New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. Earlier reporting found that Ontario's exports could represent enough electricity to power roughly 1.5 million American homes and businesses. That does not mean 1.5 million American households are facing an immediate blackout tonight. What it means is that if Ontario actually stopped those exports, that is the magnitude of American demand suddenly forced to find power elsewhere. The stronger question is not whether the lights are already off. It is, what would happen if Ford followed through? Ontario's electricity connections with U.S. markets are substantial, and at certain moments they matter enormously. New York in particular has received significant amounts of Canadian power. During a July 2026 heat wave, Canadian electricity reportedly supplied about 9% of New York's electricity needs on one day. That figure shows exactly why an export cutoff could bite during periods of extreme demand. On a scorching day, when air conditioners are running full blast and the grid is straining, losing 9% of supply is not trivial. It would not automatically mean a massive blackout across the United States, but during a peak demand crisis, that margin can be the difference between a stable grid and rolling shortages. The threat did not emerge from nowhere. It came directly on the heels of the collapse in trade negotiations. Prime Minister Mark Carney walked away from talks with the Trump administration late Friday, saying Washington demanded too much in exchange for tariff relief. The United States imposed 50% tariffs on Saturday on about $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, and Carney announced dollar-for-dollar retaliation beginning September 8th. Ford's electricity threat is part of that escalating response, the provincial complement to Ottawa's federal retaliation, adding energy and minerals to the pressure Canada is preparing to apply. Then Trump escalated again, hardening the standoff further. On Monday, the same day as Ford's comments, Trump announced that new 50% tariffs on Canadian automobiles, auto parts, and steel would begin next year. Canada has been ripping off the United States of America for years. Trump wrote on social media, criticizing what he called Canada's ridiculously high tariffs on American farmers, and adding, not sustainable and not anymore. That auto and steel threat strikes at the deeply integrated North American vehicle supply chain, where parts routinely cross the border multiple times during production, and automakers including Ford, GM, and Stellantis operate major assembly operations on both sides. And if you want the real story behind how Canada is still holding its ground through tariffs, wars, and hard times, hit join below to join the membership for exclusive documentaries you won't see anywhere else about Canada's progress and rise through uncertainty. Ford's tone reflected a province bracing for a prolonged fight. He said Trump has underestimated Canadians' willingness to endure economic pain rather than give in to U.S. pressure. He underestimates Canada. We're all in, Ford said. Up here, we're at a fever pitch. Everyone's in for an economic war. They know they're going to have to sacrifice. That framing signals Ford believes Ontario and Canada are prepared to absorb real damage, to hold their position a readiness to accept short-term pain in exchange, not capitulating to Washington's demands. On critical minerals, Ford was even more blunt than on electricity. I'll cut them off, he said, referring to the critical minerals Ontario supplies. He also called for Canada to consider using oil and potash as leverage, naming the full arsenal of Canadian resources that American industry depends on. That combination is what makes the threat serious. Electricity powers American homes and factories near the border. Critical minerals feed American technology and defense. Oil fuels American refineries. Potash feeds American agriculture. Ford is pointing at every pressure point at once, signaling that Canada's response could span the entire range of resources the United States cannot easily replace. But here's the crucial distinction, and it is the heart of the story. Ford has threatened the move. He has not actually shut off U.S. electricity. Based on the reporting available today, the power is still flowing. This is a warning, a negotiating threat backed by real capability, not an executed cutoff. The urgency is genuine, but the lights across the border remain on for now. The threat draws its power from the possibility of action, not from action already taken. There's also clear precedent that makes the threat credible rather than empty. In March 2025, Ontario briefly imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York, then suspended it the very next day. That episode matters for two reasons. It proves Ford is willing to reach for electricity as a lever, and it shows how quickly such measures can be deployed and withdrawn. Ontario has done a version of this before. The 2025 surcharge was a warning shot. The current threat raises the stakes from a surcharge to a potential full cutoff. Ford's history with Trump adds another layer. His Reagan comments this week revived an earlier clash. Last year, Ontario paid for U.S. television advertisements featuring excerpts from a 1987 Reagan address, warning that tariffs provoke retaliation and trade wars. Trump accused Ontario of misrepresenting Reagan and abruptly ended trade negotiations before Ford agreed to pause the campaign so talks could resume. This week, Ford said Reagan would be throwing up over Trump's trade policies, reviving that fight and invoking Cold War-era Republican leadership to underscore how far the relationship has deteriorated. Notably, even while threatening to cut off power, Ford insisted he still favors negotiation. I never believe in walking away from the table, Ford said. Continue negotiating and see where we go. That stance reveals the threat's true purpose. It is leverage designed to pull Washington back toward a deal, not necessarily a commitment to darken American homes. Ford wants the pressure of a possible cutoff to change Trump's calculus while keeping the door open to a negotiated resolution. So the decisive question is whether Ford's warning stays a negotiating threat or becomes an actual export cutoff, and how U.S. states, electricity markets, and Washington would respond if it did. The power that lights up to 1.5 million American homes, that supplied 9% of New York's grid on a peak summer day, now sits in the crosshairs of a trade war that keeps escalating. Carney walked away from the table. The tariffs are live. Trump has threatened auto and steel duties for next year. And Ford has made clear that Ontario's electricity, its minerals, and Canada's oil and potash are all weapons he is willing to reach for.